Hello, everybody. This is our follow-up video for the discussion of Module 4. There were a couple of different things that came up in several threads that I thought would be good just to take a minute and go back and reflect on a little more so that we could all make sure we're on the same page, or maybe we'll continue the conversation here in discussion of this video. First off, the one thing I wanted to address that came up in a discussion in one of the groups with Will and others was a question about the nature of prudence and whether prudence could be used for bad ends, right? So, is it possible to be prudent in pursuit of something immoral, right? So, um, and here we had an interesting discussion, and I think Will brought up some good points that Aquinas would agree with. But I do think it's also helpful to sort through the distinction between prudence and some of the other virtues. Um, so what I would say at this point, right, is that prudence is really focused on how we implement um, our moral norms in the complex situations we face in real life, right? So, what prudence does is it gives us an understanding of and the ability to properly act so as to bring about the right ends, right? So, we see the complex situation where, say, one group is taking advantage of another group and depriving them of their uh, fair share of the proceeds of a business, right? This can be really complicated. And what justice does, justice looks at the situation and determines, hey, these guys are taking an unfair share. These people are being harmed and treated unfairly. So justice gives us an understanding of um, everyone being provided their proper due. And then prudence is what allows us to assess this complex situation and then engage with it in a way that is going to bring about the proper outcome, where that we end up moving from this unjust arrangement to a more just arrangement. So that's really what prudence does. Prudence is what allows the other virtues to be realized in the real world and to produce the proper results that will lead towards the flourishing of people. So one of the ways that Aquinas puts it is, right, prudence doesn't give us the ends, prudence gives us the means, right? And so that's the sense in which I was saying, look, bad people can be prudent, right? Bad people can have a really well honed ability to know how to implement their desires in complex situations and bring about their goals, right? So if we think of prudence sort of in that sense, then people who are really prudent, who have that kind of practical wisdom, are going to be able to be worse, if you will, than those who are not, right? So you could have somebody who really wants to be unjust, but who's just inept in their ability to carry that out, um, which is actually, obviously in many ways a better situation than someone who is just as unjust, but is much more adept at actually implementing their desires in the real world, right? Now, going back to Aquinas and to Will's point, right, that prudence, properly speaking, is only in pursuit of good ends, right? So that Aquinas would say that the prudence exhibited by a bad person, or what would seem to be prudence or practical wisdom used in pursuit of bad ends, is actually a false prudence, right? Because a proper prudence would also involve understanding that this is an immoral pursuit, that this is an immoral end, and therefore it ought not to be done. Um, okay, so just to clarify that, yes, properly speaking, prudence used towards bad ends is false prudence. But we also need to make sure, right, that we understand that prudence isn't what sets proper ends, right? Prudence is the means of getting there. It's the other virtues like justice or charity that help us know what goals we are supposed to aim for. So just want to make sure we were clear on that. Um, The other big thing that came up in some of the discussions in the threads was talking about the possibility of uh, being more refined in our understanding of moral norms, so that, for example, the very simple statement, thou shalt not steal, may not be adequately nuanced to deal with every situation, right? And instead of saying just thou shalt not steal, a more specific way of expressing the norm of natural law would be don't intentionally take something that another person has a moral claim to, right? Um, so the example that came up again in one of the discussions was, could if you have a loved one dying of a disease, there's a drug that cures the disease in a pharmacy, but the pharmacy owners will not sell the drug at a price that you can afford. You try all the other means for acquiring the drug, um, and there's no way to get it. Your loved one is going to die. So you break into the pharmacy, take the drug, give it to your loved one to save their life. So is this immoral? Is this stealing? Right? And so, again, I think this is where we need to be very careful about our language, right? Because we would call this, well, you can steal the medicine to save your loved one. But I think we need to differentiate here that not all taking of another's property is necessarily stealing, right? So someone can have a physical possession of a thing, or someone can even have a legal claim to a thing without them actually having a moral claim to it, right? So, for example, if someone steals something from another person, we don't say it's stealing for the government to intervene and forcibly take away the stolen property and give it back to the original owner, right? That is not the latter action is not stealing. It is restoring goods to their rightful owner. Or when a child takes a toy from another child, um, and we intervene and give the toy back to the first child, that is not stealing from the child who stole from the other child, right? It is in fact a restoring of what belonged rightfully to the first child, right? This also happens, in on the governmental scale, right? That you could have a country go in and unjustly take a bunch of land. Um, it is not immoral for the people who receive title to that land um, from this unjust government to have their property taken away from them and given back to the original owners. Right. So even though they would have a legal document that says you have the title to this land, that doesn't make it morally theirs. They don't have a moral right to that property. Right. So it is not what is legal and what is moral does not always match up. Right. And that is at one of the key things to have in mind as we're looking at this pharmacy scenario, right? So one of the principles of Catholic morality is that the goods of the world are given to humankind as a whole, right? That God gives us the world for the benefit of everyone. Now, yes, we do have, as Waddell talks about, we do have private property as a means of preserving personal dignity and as a way of incentivizing productive behavior, but it is always a secondary right. It is always an instrumental right? That the bigger claim, the more basic claim, is that God gives us the world for the good of all, right? And so if we have people who accumulate goods in a way that deprives others of what is needful for their basic maintenance of their human dignity, that accumulation of goods is unjust. That person doesn't have a moral claim to the wealth or to the excess goods they accumulate, even if they have a legal claim to it, even if their governmental system says, yep, you can have all that stuff you've amassed. And even though those people are dying outside of your gated community, that stuff is yours. You don't have any obligation to share it, right? And Catholic morality would say, no, we do in fact have a moral obligation to care for those around us. So if I have a medicine that will cure a person who is dying outside of my store, and if they are unable to pay me for it, but I am able to provide that medicine without it unjustly harming my own good, right? It's not going to make me destitute. It's not going to lead to my death from want or hunger. Then I, in fact, have a moral obligation to provide this good to others. Right now, yes, in our standard economic functioning, we see it as reasonable for people to have a reasonable profit for their effort, for their ingenuity. But in the moment where I could save another by offering them a good that I have an excess of, um, then I have a moral obligation to provide that, right? And so that would be why, in this situation, taking the drug from the pharmacy is not necessarily immoral. Again, granted that we've taken all other opportunities and possibilities of getting it without resorting to that step. Um, Now, in some of the discussion, right, there were a couple points brought up. One was, um, well, are we choosing the lesser of two evils, right? And that's a common way of describing these sorts of situations, but that description does not fit Catholic morality. This is not choosing the lesser of two evils, right? This is um, taking something that a person doesn't have a moral right to and giving it to someone who has a real moral need to be met is not stealing at all. It is not an evil at all. It is a just distribution of goods, right? So we are not committing an evil of stealing in order to do a good thing, right? What we are doing is creating a more just distribution of goods. Um, Now, again, is that really the case in this situation? That would be something that would have to uh, be sorted out. But at least in theory, in a theoretical situation, that sort of thing could happen, could exist, and that action could be justified, and it would not be the lesser of two evils. Um, or on the other hand, right, one could argue, well, look, in the Catholic view, suffering is an opportunity for spiritual growth. And so if we look kind of on that scale, on the eternal scale, maybe the better option is simply to allow the suffering and death, and there will be a spiritual benefit that comes from that. Um, and to that, again, this is not certainly to deny that there can be good that comes out of suffering. But the fact that good can come out of suffering does not mean that we ought to allow suffering to occur when we can rightly and morally prevent it or bring it to an end or minimize it. Right? That we are, in fact, called to prevent suffering of sickness and hunger and loneliness. Um, we as Christians are supposed to seek to end those sufferings as much as possible. Right? So, yes, there can be good that comes out of suffering. There can be good that comes out of being the victim of an unjust attack. That doesn't mean that we then don't intervene to make the world more moral and more just when we are able to do so. And so, again, in that situation, we should try other methods. And if there's no way to fix it, then yes, there can be spiritual good that comes from the suffering and even death. But that doesn't mean that we ought not to intervene in order to make sure an innocent person doesn't needlessly die. So we can certainly talk about this more on the weekend, but I wanted to highlight those things because it's really important to be clear on what we're saying that natural law um, approves and how we apply it to specific situations using prudence. So I look forward to further conversations with you, and feel free to reply in the discussion on the announcement here if you want to talk about this further.